I trusted my best friend with the business I built from scratch. He stole it from me by forging documents and throwing me out on the street. He thought I would disappear, but he didn't know I was already planning his downfall. The first time I met Jackson Whitley, I knew we'd either become best friends or mortal enemies. There was something magnetic about him, that easy charm, the way he could work a room full of investors like a conductor leading an orchestra. What I didn't realize was that we'd end up being both. I had the idea for Midnight and Main, a premium cocktail bar that would bring a touch of New York sophistication to our corner of Chicago's River North District. What I didn't have was the connections or the management experience to make it happen. That's where Jackson came in. We met at a startup networking event in the winter of 2019. I was pitching my concept to anyone who would listen, and Jackson actually stayed to hear the whole thing. He didn't just listen, he asked the right questions, pointed out potential pitfalls I hadn't considered, and most importantly, saw the same vision I did. "You've got the concept down cold," he said, nursing a bourbon. "But you need someone who knows how to navigate the Chicago nightlife scene. The licensing, the suppliers, the right people to know. Let me guess, someone like you." I remember smiling, already knowing where this was going. His answering grin was confident but not cocky. "I've opened 3 successful venues in the last 5 years. But this?" He gestured to my presentation materials. "This could be something special." We spent the next 6 hours at that bar, long after the networking event had ended, sketching out plans on napkins and dreaming big. By the time we left, we had the beginnings of a partnership. I would put up the initial capital, my life savings plus a second mortgage on my condo, and Jackson would bring his expertise and connections. We agreed on a 50-50 split, shaking hands like brothers. The first year was a blur of 18-hour days, endless permit applications, and more setbacks than I care to remember. But we pushed through together. Jackson knew exactly which palms to grease at City Hall to speed up our liquor license. I handled the design and atmosphere, creating something that felt both luxurious and welcoming. Opening night was magic. The line stretched around the block, and the energy inside was electric. I still remember standing behind the bar with Jackson at 3 a.m., after the last customers had left, both of us exhausted but grinning like idiots. "We did it, partner," he said, pouring us each a measure of our most expensive scotch. "To Midnight and Main," I raised my glass. "To Empire Building," he countered, with what I now recognize was a hint of something darker in his eyes. The success of that first location led naturally to expansion. Within 2 years, we had 3 bars across Chicago, each with its own unique character but maintaining that core concept of sophisticated cocktail culture. The money was rolling in, and our friendship seemed unshakable. Jackson and I weren't just business partners, we were in each other's weddings, godparents to each other's kids. Looking back, I should have seen the warning signs sooner. They were subtle at first, like ripples on a calm lake before a storm. It started with small things, Jackson rescheduling our weekly management meetings, claiming scheduling conflicts. He began holding supplier negotiations without me, explaining it away as efficiency. "You're better with the creative side anyway," he'd say, clapping me on the shoulder. "Let me handle the boring stuff." His smile was the same as always, but something felt off. Then came the expansion into River West. A prime location had opened up, and Jackson was pushing hard for us to take it. The numbers seemed aggressive, but he had spreadsheets full of projections showing how we could make it work. "Trust me on this one," he said during a late-night planning session. "I've got some private investors lined up who can help with the capital. We just need to adjust the ownership structure a bit." I hesitated. Adjust how? Nothing major. Just creating a new holding company to handle the expansion. Makes things cleaner for the investors. He slid a stack of papers across the table. "Standard stuff. I've already had legal look it over." I trusted him. That was my first real mistake. The next few months were a whirlwind of construction and preparations for the new location. Jackson took point on everything, insisting I focus on training the staff and developing the cocktail program. He was working longer hours than ever, and I felt guilty questioning his dedication. Then the strange charges started appearing in our books. Large consulting fees to companies I'd never heard of. Wire transfers to offshore accounts. When I asked about them, Jackson always had a plausible explanation ready. Tax optimization, he'd say, or investment diversification. He'd launch into detailed explanations that left my head spinning. The real red flags started appearing after the River West location opened. Suddenly, I found myself blocked from accessing certain financial accounts. Emails about executive decisions were going to everyone but me. Staff members who had been loyal to me for years began treating me differently, more distantly. I finally cornered Jackson in his office one evening, demanding answers. He was on his phone, barely looking up as I entered. "The system's been glitching," he said dismissively. "IT's working on it. Listen, I've got to take this call, major investor on the line. We'll catch up later, okay?" That night, I couldn't sleep. Something in Jackson's tone, his body language, it all felt wrong. I called Marcus, a lawyer friend who had helped with our initial partnership agreement, and asked him to look into things quietly. 2 days later, Marcus called me back. His voice was grave. "You need to come to my office. Now." The papers Marcus showed me made my blood run cold. Through a series of carefully orchestrated legal maneuvers, Jackson had effectively transferred controlling interest in our entire operation to a new holding company, one where my ownership stake was precisely zero. "He's been planning this for at least a year," Marcus said, spreading out the documents. "Look at the dates. Every time he had you sign something for the River West expansion, he was actually building his legal framework. The holding company, the investor agreements, the restructuring, it was all designed to push you out." I felt physically sick. "Can we fight this?" Marcus's expression was grim. "We can try, but he's covered his tracks well. The paperwork looks legitimate. He's got witnesses, notarized documents, even email trails showing your apparent agreement to these changes. Fighting this in court could take years, and he's got deeper pockets than you now." I found Jackson at midnight and Main that evening, sitting at our original bar like nothing was wrong. He was sampling a new whiskey delivery, making notes in his leather-bound tasting journal, the one I'd given him for his birthday last year. "You forged my signature," I said quietly, sliding one of the documents across the bar. He didn't even look surprised. Just took another sip of whiskey, savoring it before responding. "Prove it. Everything we built, I trusted you with everything. That's your problem right there." He finally looked up, his eyes cold and unfamiliar. "You trusted. I executed. This business needed someone who could make tough decisions, not some cocktail enthusiast playing at being an entrepreneur." "Playing?" My voice cracked. "I put everything I had into this place. My savings, my home equity. And you'll get a nice severance package," he cut in smoothly. "Be smart about this. Walk away clean, sign the separation agreement, and you can start fresh somewhere else. Fight me, and I'll make sure you never work in this industry again." Security appeared at my shoulders, men I didn't recognize. Jackson must have hired a new team without my knowledge. "Please escort my former partner out," he said, already turning back to his whiskey. "He's no longer authorized to be on the premises." As they led me to the door, Jackson called out, "It's just business, buddy. Nothing personal." I stood on the sidewalk outside my own bar, watching through the windows as Jackson raised his glass in a mock toast. The rage I felt in that moment was unlike anything I'd experienced before. But beneath the anger, something else was crystallizing, the beginning of a plan. That night, I didn't go home. Instead, I went to a 24-hour diner and opened my laptop. If Jackson thought I would just disappear, he had seriously miscalculated. I started making lists, every supplier we'd ever worked with, every investor, every city official Jackson had ever smoothed things over with. I still had copies of emails, contracts, and financial records from the early days, before Jackson had locked me out of the systems. I remembered something else too, something Jackson had said during one of our late-night planning sessions months ago, when he'd had too much to drink. He'd bragged about how he handled the tax implications of our rapid expansion, describing a complicated web of shell companies and creative accounting that had seemed impressive at the time. Now, those drunken boasts took on a different meaning. If Jackson had been planning my ouster for a year, he'd probably been siphoning money away for even longer. The question was, where had it gone, and who else knew about it? I opened a new document and began to type, starting with a simple header, Operation Judas. The next 3 months were the most focused time of my life. I rented a small office in a rundown building in Bucktown, covering the walls with documents, financial records, and sticky notes connected by red string. It looked like something out of a conspiracy theorist's dream, but every connection was real, every piece of evidence carefully verified. I started with the suppliers. Jackson had always insisted on handling them personally, but I still had relationships from the early days. Over coffee with our original liquor distributor, Tony, I learned that Jackson had been running a double billing scheme, charging the bars premium prices while pocketing the difference from bulk discount rates. I always wondered why he insisted on paper invoices, Tony said, shaking his head. Digital would have been easier. The contractor who had renovated our River West location was even more interesting. He'd been forced to inflate his invoices, with the excess being funneled through a construction consulting firm. The firm's address? A P.O. box registered to Jackson's brother-in-law. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Linda, our former bookkeeper who Jackson had abruptly retired 6 months ago, reached out through a mutual friend. She had kept her own records, including copies of suspicious wire transfers and correspondence about offshore accounts. I knew something wasn't right, she told me over lunch. But every time I raised concerns, he would remind me about my son's college tuition, which the company was helping with. It was a subtle threat, but I got the message. I hired a forensic accountant to analyze everything we'd uncovered. His report was damning. Jackson hadn't just stolen my share of the business, he'd been systematically embezzling for years, using a network of shell companies and fraudulent invoices to hide the money trail. The pieces were in place. Now it was time to let them fall. I started with anonymous tips to the IRS and the FBI about potential tax fraud and money laundering. But that was just the beginning. I knew Jackson had enemies in the industry, competitors he'd undercut or threatened over the years. I reached out to them, sharing proof of his illegal practices. They were more than happy to add their own complaints to the growing chorus of investigations. Next, I focused on his investors. Jackson had attracted several wealthy backers for our expansion, people who valued their reputations above all else. I made sure they received detailed documentation of his financial misconduct, especially the parts that could implicate them if they didn't act quickly to distance themselves. The pressure began to mount. Health inspectors started showing up at our bars with unusual frequency. Liquor license renewals were delayed. Suppliers began demanding payment up front. Jackson's carefully constructed house of cards was starting to wobble. But the masterstroke came from Linda. She had maintained relationships with the accounting staff and heard whispers that Jackson was planning to sell the business before things got worse. He had already approached a national restaurant group about acquiring our locations. That's when I leaked everything to the Chicago Tribune. The story ran on a Sunday, award-winning bar empire built on fraud and betrayal. The article detailed every scheme, every fraudulent transaction, complete with documents and insider testimonials. By Monday morning, the FBI had opened a formal investigation. I watched it all unfold from a distance, nursing a bourbon in a dive bar on the opposite side of town. Jackson's carefully curated social media showed no signs of trouble. He was still posting photos of charity events and inspirational quotes about entrepreneurship. But I knew his world was crumbling. The end came on a Tuesday morning. I was there, watching from my car across the street from Midnight and Main, when the FBI vehicles pulled up. They weren't subtle about it, 3 black SUVs and a dozen agents in windbreakers with FBI emblazoned across the back. Jackson was in his usual spot at the end of the bar, reviewing invoices over his morning coffee. Through the front windows, I could see the moment he realized what was happening. His face, always so controlled, so confident, suddenly went slack with shock. The agents entered with purpose, badges held high. Even from outside, I could read the mix of emotions that crossed Jackson's face: disbelief, anger, and finally, the dawning realization that his empire was over. As they led him out in handcuffs, his eyes scanned the growing crowd of onlookers and found mine. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then his face twisted with rage. "You," he shouted. "You did this." I stepped forward from the crowd, hands in my pockets, and gave him the same casual shrug he'd given me months ago. "It's just business, buddy. Nothing personal." The look of pure hatred on his face as they pushed him into the SUV was almost worth everything I'd lost. Almost. That evening, I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by the evidence of my revenge: papers, photos, hard drives full of damning information. I should have felt triumphant. Jackson was facing federal charges. His reputation was destroyed. The business he'd stolen from me was collapsing. I'd won. But victory tasted different than I'd imagined. I poured myself a drink, the same expensive scotch we'd shared on opening night, and thought about everything that had led to this moment. The friendship that had turned toxic. The trust that had been weaponized against me. The months I'd spent consumed by revenge, letting it drive every decision, every waking moment. My phone buzzed with a news alert: Chicago bar mogul arrested on federal fraud charges. Below it was a text from Marcus: "You did it. Justice served." What's next? What's next? I looked at the empty glass in my hand, thinking about the countless nights Jackson and I had spent planning our future, dreaming about building something lasting. Now those dreams were ashes, and I'd helped burn them down. 6 months later, I opened a new bar in Wicker Park. Smaller than Midnight and Main, more intimate. The kind of place where you can actually talk to your customers, build real relationships. I called it The Price. Let people read into that what they would. Jackson took a plea deal. 5 years in federal prison, plus restitution. I heard through the grapevine that his wife left him, took the kids to California. Sometimes I think about visiting him, just to see if the man I once considered a brother is still in there somewhere beneath the betrayal and bitterness. I haven't gone. Not yet. Last week, I got an envelope in the mail, no return address, but I recognized the handwriting. Inside was a single piece of paper with 2 words: "Well played." I burned it without responding. Some games, once started, never really end. But I keep a closer eye on my new business partners these days. And I've learned that trust, like the finest whiskey, should be measured out carefully. Every night, as I'm closing up The Price, I raise a glass to the empty bar. Not to success, not to revenge, but to lessons learned. Because in the end, betrayal teaches you things about yourself that loyalty never can. Sometimes I wonder if Jackson knew that when he started down this path. If he understood that by destroying our friendship, he'd create something else, something darker and more lasting than all our business plans combined. But those are thoughts for another night, another drink. For now, I have a bar to run. And this time, I'm the only one holding the keys.